deployment, and we're going to talk about this in the context of our partners and prospective partners that are listening today. So if you're not familiar with Atlantis Computing, let me give you a quick introduction before we get started. So we're really focused on delivering software that optimizes virtual desktop and soon virtual server environments. So we're headquartered in Silicon Valley. We have offices in Europe as well as sales teams around the world. We first shipped our products in 2009, where we've been growing very fast. We have over 130 employees today, 180 resellers globally. And one of the things we're most proud of is we have a large and very fast-growing customer base with over 500 licenses sold, including some of the largest desktop virtualization deployments in the world. We have great partnerships with, of course, kind of the key desktop virtualization solutions in VMware and Citrix, as well as some of the key infrastructure vendors. Great partnerships with IBM, HP, Dell, Cisco, BC, NetApp, and many others. As I mentioned, we are deployed at some of the largest distant virtual desktops, stateless virtual desktops, as well as a very fast-growing install base of XenApp implementations and RDS implementations. We've also won some of the most prestigious awards in the industry, Best of Citrix Synergy, Best of VMworld, both in Europe and the US. So let's kind of, here are kind of the 5 key things I'm going to talk about today that are really critical for a successful VDI deployment. First is really around developing the business case. Historically, VDI has had a difficult time comparing to physical PCs on a cost per desktop basis, at least when you size it to have a proper user experience that's equal or better than a physical PC. So developing the business case based on an architecture that will deliver a good user experience is a critical part of VDI, so we'll start with that. Second is really understanding user requirements, both from a user experience perspective, the performance of the desktop, enabling critical functions in VDI. Many times there are tuning that's done that disables things that users are used to using that limits user experience. 3 is more around designing around user experience. So what kind of design metrics, what kind of sizing do you need to do to ensure that users are not moving from a physical desktop to a virtual desktop that's slower or has a worse user experience. 4th is really evaluating storage requirements and understanding how storage scales in a virtual desktop environment and avoiding some of the pitfalls that have led to a lot of project delays and failures in the past. And then 5th is really planning for the future. So desktop virtualization is evolving very rapidly. People are changing different types of desktop virtualization, and you need to design your architectures, your plan, how you manage the projects to be able to adapt to changes in the market. Because many desktop virtualization projects take years to fully implement at scale, and within that time frame there will be changes if you need to be able to adapt to those. So let's talk a little bit about adapting the business case. So the number one challenge in developing a business case for VDI is that storage can be a very significant portion of the total cost per desktop, to the point where it makes the business case completely cost prohibitive for an end user. So the key is, you see this chart from Gartner in a recent report called Attacking the High Cost of Desktop Virtualization, and they're showing $1,000 per user in storage for VDI. Now, that sounds excessive, and there's a lot of marketing done around, $50 per user, $100 per user in storage, but often that compromises on the user experience. So the key is really delivering delivering a cost per desktop that is equal or less than a physical PC on a CapEx basis, so the upfront cost of the physical PC, without compromising on the user experience. So users expect a desktop that is equal or better. So that's really the key of the business case, is how do you solve that storage cost problem without cutting corners in user experience. Okay, some of the key things to understand here is that the business case is a combination of CapEx, which is the upfront acquisition cost of all of the hardware and software required to deliver VDI, and then the ongoing OpEx, or operational costs. So this includes data center space, power, cooling, administrative activities for all of the underlying hardware and software. And so a couple of key things to understand here is, first, storage can be 60% of that upfront CapEx cost. So focusing on the storage aspect of VDI is the easiest way to cut that cost per desktop. Second is that OpEx can be 2 or 3x depending on your time frame. You know, usually customers are looking at a 3 to 5 year window of amortization for how they're looking at their VDI environment. If you look at over 3 years, it can be 2 to 3x in OpEx what the upfront CapEx is. And again, storage is a big part of that. If it's 60% on the CapEx, the data center space, power, cooling, and administration of storage is a big chunk of that OpEx. So by focusing on the storage aspect, you can really trim both of these pieces of the equation and, you know, bring down the cost per desktop to a point where it's very attractive for customers to deploy VDI. So let's take a look at a 1,000-user example. Traditional, in this case, persistent VDI. So, before you get into the business case, obviously you need to sort out, this is going to be a persistent virtual desktop, stateless virtual desktop, XenApp, or a mix of one or more of those type of desktop virtualization models. Each of those has different cost implications. So in this case, this is a persistent virtual desktop, which is typically deployed with Tier 1 SAN or NAS, because you need high availability in that case. To deliver 30 IOPS per desktop, this customer at street price was requiring $1.2 million in total storage costs over 4 years. So that includes, and this is heavily discounted, kind of Tier 1 SAN NAS. So that includes the upfront acquisition costs and the maintenance and power, cooling, and rack space for the disks required to deliver 30 IOPS. Conversely, Atlantis ILIO, with a smaller amount of SAN or NAS, is about 70% less total storage costs over that 4-year period. And on a CapEx basis, from an upfront acquisition cost, you can see the cost is reduced from a total cost per desktop on a CapEx basis from $500 to under $300, which we found for persistent VDI, the total stack of infrastructure under $300 means that it's possible for them to deliver a total cost per desktop that's in that $500 to $600 range, which is competitive with their physical PC acquisition costs. So let's talk about some of the user requirements. So making users happy is key to having a successful VDI deployment. By its nature, VDI gives users some benefits. So mobility, bringing your own desktop programs, being able to access from any device. However, there are typically some downsides with a standard VDI deployment. One is it's generally slower than a physical PC, much of which has to do with storage. So you need to kind of address that. The other one is, depending on the desktop virtualization model, you could be removing things that the user has in a physical PC environment. For example, if you go with a stateless virtual desktop, you typically the user can't install applications. So you kind of need to take that into account. Are your users able to install applications today? If so, you might want to consider doing a persistent virtual desktop so they can maintain that user experience. Because if part of switching to a virtual desktop means giving up functionality, then users won't be happy with that. We'll also talk a little bit about search later, but search is really key for users, and things like window indexing are often turned off when you go into a VDI environment to save on storage infrastructure because it generates so much I/O. So that's another kind of consideration to look at. From an IT organization perspective, we need to look at how we simplify things, delivering architectures that are proven, reliable, easy to manage, and account for whatever the level of high availability and disaster recovery is required. Again, these things have implications in terms of what desktop virtualization model you want to employ. We'll talk a little bit about stateless versus VDI versus an app or traditional PCs and how that affects IT in a minute. And then from a cost perspective, to make the business case, again, you really need to get to the point where you can design an architecture where the CapEx or the upfront acquisition cost is equal or lower than a physical PC. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to make the case to management and the CFO that you should do VDI on a large scale. OpEx is also a big factor. So power, cooling, rack space, data centers. If you can show reductions there or minimize the amount consumed there, that's key in a virtual desktop deployment. Okay, so let's talk a little bit in more detail about user experience from a storage perspective. So let's think about existing users who are using physical PCs. At the very low end, you buy the least expensive PC that you can get, and you're going to be looking at a 7,200 RPM hard drive, which has 50, 75, sometimes 100 IOPS per desktop. And it's dedicated, so you always have 50 to 75 guaranteed, and it's very low latency because it's on your motherboard. Now, an Ultrabook or a MacBook Air laptop with a SSD, you're talking kind of 3,000 to 5,000 IOPS per desktop, and that is one of the key selling points is how fast a MacBook Air or an Ultrabook is, and that's because of the underlying I/O performance. That's part of the reason that it's so fast. Now, virtual desktops is really a question mark. I've seen people design VDI with anywhere from 1.2 IOPS per user, and they didn't intentionally do that, but that's what ended up happening. Anywhere from 1.2 to 1,000 IOPS per desktop, and that amount of variation directly impacts what the user experience is. So the question is, how fast will users demand their virtual desktop to be? Now, that's again, keep in mind that the success of your deployment depends on users being happy. You deploy VDI to your exec, your CEO, and the performance is terrible, that your project's going to be in trouble. So let's talk a little bit around some of the details of I/O, and besides just the total IOPS number, there's a lot of other factors in user experience and performance from a storage perspective. One is you need the ability to deliver consistent levels of high performance. So, when everything is, a user is just idling or they're doing kind of normal tasks, you might be able to deliver performance. But when they launch a bunch of applications, when they create a PDF file, when they zip something, when there's an AV scan going on, when there's multiple systems running IO-intensive things at the same time, like a patch, the performance can degrade. So even if most of the day your performance is fine from an I/O perspective, there are points in time where you have very heavy load and you need to be able to accommodate for that. So this kind of goes to the point of designing for peak load from an I/O perspective. Other factors here, it's extremely write intensive, and many people they may have heard of this, but it has a big impact on I/O. So you have to design your RAID levels and factor in how much write penalty there is. It's small I/O, so it has an average 4 kilobyte block size. It tends to be very random. There's a very high peak to average ratio. So all of these factor in to create one of the toughest workloads for storage to handle, unlike any other server-based workload. So you really need to handle VDI workloads differently, apply some intelligence, try to optimize it as much as possible. It's very difficult to mix VDI with other workloads on a storage array without having performance degradation and then having to go back and redesign your architecture. Okay, so let me show you an example, and if we have time, we'll do a little demonstration later live. But this is my actual physical desktop running Windows 7 using an in-memory data store. So this is on an Atlantis ILIO data store, which has virtually unlimited IOPS. And I go through over a 10-minute period launching various applications and doing some different activities. So you can see that if you have it available, you can use insane amounts of IOPS. So, you have things like Excel. When I'm launching an Excel sheet using 3,700 IOPS. Then you have kind of Windows 7 update happening in the background, which is equivalent to a patch doing 4,000 IOPS. And then you have these random spikes where Windows is doing all this background relaying out things on disk or page files. You don't know what that is, but you have a random spike to 2,000 IOPS during idle. So you can see over this 10-minute period, I'm averaging over 400 IOPS per desktop. Now, over a whole day or a night, when you're not using your desktop, that average may be 10 or 20, 30. But when I'm actively launching things in the morning, very busy in the afternoon, I can use this kind of IOPS. And if you don't have this, you just extend out the area under the line, and it takes longer to launch applications, basically. So instead of having kind of instant, less than a second application launch, you're taking 10 seconds. You're taking much longer to do each activity, which has a negative impact on user experience. Okay, so let's talk about what this means. IOPS in an abstract sense, it doesn't mean much. Like, why do I need 1,000 IOPS or more than 10 or 20 or 30? What does that translate to in user experience? So what we see is that customers that deploy VDI with 10 IOPS, for example, or even less, even 30 IOPS, we'll see things like boot times that take several minutes instead of a boot time that's 12 seconds. You'll see app launches that are 5 to 10 seconds versus near instant, like you click the button and it's open type app launch activity. Search is often disabled, and it's like a best practice in general to disable, from some of the best practices guides from the VDI vendors, to disable Windows indexing. Now, it's a best practice in that it means you use a significantly less IOPS and storage, but users like to search in Outlook. Users like to be able to search their desktop without having a long wait time. And if we have time, I'll do the demo later and show you a search of my C drive and how fast that goes. Now, you kind of, let's step back for a second. We need to, as we're designing our architecture and evaluating our storage requirements, we need to understand the complete stack. What kind of desktop virtualization are we implementing? What storage implications does that have? How do I need to size my servers in relation to that? How is my networking affected by that type of implementation and design? And then really when you get down to the storage, that becomes the critical kind of backbone because it's the hard drive of all of your virtual desktops, right? So, but everything in the path and the design needs to be understood from the top of the stack to the bottom. So let's look at kind of flexibility. This is another aspect, flexibility, that ability to plan for the future. If we look at persistent VDI in particular, it's a very, very inflexible type implementation. You generally have to use a lot of tier 1 SAN, if that's fiber channel networking. And then you have stateless VDI where you have a lot more storage options. But you're going to move, you're going to have a mixed environment, and the flexibility to be able to move between the two and change your infrastructure without ripping out and replacing the underlying hardware is key. So with Atlantis, you're able to deploy and optimize existing SAN NAS. You can leverage local flash, or in our in-memory deployments, you can actually use local server DRAM as primary storage for virtual desktops. And you can work with any of the VDI or XenApp implementation models, Citrix MCS, PVS, VMware View Full Clone, Link Clones, any storage that's supported by the hypervisor, including the ability to do in-memory, which is unique to Atlantis. Okay, let's talk about typical deployment risks. So VDI deployments tend to be quite risky. You can undersize various components. There's a lot of moving parts. Storage sizing is one of those very tricky aspects, and rollouts can take 6 months to, we've seen that some that are years long and still not complete. With Atlantis, we're really able to simplify the architecture, fewer moving parts, less hardware, and we can automate deployments. So we can take a group of servers, press a button, roll out Atlantis, help provision all of the desktops, and be up and running within weeks. We have customers that have gone from calling us to live in 2 weeks. So, sorting out the architecture, automating deployments really has a huge benefit in terms of deployment time and lowering risk of deployments. Okay, so let's talk about the different desktop virtualization models and some of the trade-offs between them. So one thing is you have to start by relating everything to what you do today with a physical PC. So there's been years, 20+ years of standardization on processes, deploying applications, patching, desktop support. How you manage the desktops has all been built up in organizations. Especially the larger the organization, the more entrenched the existing physical PC operations are. Persistent VDI is really the closest to a physical PC because you're actually taking a full Windows image and just running it in the data center. You can do this very quickly. It leverages generally shared storage. There's no real change in how you manage patching, application distribution. It's just you're taking the same image you had on a physical PC and moving it into the data center. Now, it has problems involved with it, namely a lot of storage required generally, networking and so forth. But you also have stateless. So stateless can be very good in certain cases where you have limited applications. Users don't need to install applications. But if you try and kind of force stateless for users who need to be able to use persistent, or if you try and re-engineer your entire set of desktop management processes all at once to move everybody to stateless, that's been very difficult for a lot of our customers. So we've really seen kind of persistent be an easiest first step into VDI, unless you're doing something like call center or you're a hospital with a very set applications, or education is another example where stateless is very common. Now I wanted to highlight a couple things. These graphs are courtesy of Project VRC and Yaron, their the CTO, logging consultants. I just wanted to highlight there are things that change in your environment, like upgrading from Office 2010 to Office 2013, or upgrading any significant application. This actually increases, going from Office 2000 to 2013 actually increases write I/O at peak by about 40%. That means you need 40% more storage from an Office perspective, which is significant. That's one of your key applications generally. And so if you are designing your IOPS and you're very close to the threshold of not being able to satisfy the write I/O, you upgrade to Office 2013, you're actually buying more SAN upgrade Office 2013, which is not desirable. Okay, another example, Windows indexing. So Windows indexing in Office 2010 increases IOPS by about 20%. So that's another on top of the migration from one version of Office to another. Indexing, the ability to search in Outlook very quickly, adds a lot of IOPS as well. Here's another one, antivirus. So generally, customers will want to run antivirus in the image, just like they do on physical PCs. Now, there are versions of antivirus that are designed for VDI, but if you want to use your standard antivirus system, it can have a dramatic effect on the amount of IOPS, and in some cases, you can see up to 3 times the amount because it's doing on-demand scanning of all of these, basically all of the I/O operations in the virtual desktop. So basically, when you implement Atlantis, we can have a major effect on all of these parameters that are required to have a successful VDI deployment. First of all, cost per desktop. We can have huge impacts on CapEx and OpEx to the point where we can bring it down below a physical PC cost while delivering a user experience that is faster than a physical PC and even faster than MacBook Air with a local SSD. Give you the flexibility to move between different types of desktop virtualization models without changing your hardware and storage infrastructure. We simplify the deployment and lower the risk of deployments so that you can go live faster. And we have proven scalability. Our largest deployment in production to 100,000 users. So we've been able to, and we have many 10,000 user plus deployments as well. So we've been able to deploy this at scale, help customers be successful, help partners sell to larger size deals using the Atlantis ILIO software. So just to summarize on a couple of key things, and again, the focus is kind of delivering something that's better than a physical PC. So for persistent VDI, many users will want to install apps and customize their desktop. So, give persistent VDI to the appropriate users. That's key. Enable search. Don't disable critical functionality just because it saves you on I/O. Design for the equivalent search, the equivalent functionality from a security perspective of a physical PC. Storage performance. We recommend doing 100 plus IOPS. Now, with normal traditional storage, that's not cost effective, but you're going to be compromising if you don't design for more than a physical PC. For application performance, you need to look at doing 2 vCPU instead of 1 vCPU. There's a lot of data on Project DRC around the benefits of that. Antivirus, again, there are antiviruses that are designed for VDI, but you need to understand the security trade-offs of that and versus the benefit of that. And if you have something that can deliver a lot of I/O, you may not need to make that trade-off, and you can just use the same antivirus you've been using today. And then validate and test. You really need to test, pilot, prove out the architecture before you roll out on a large scale, or you're kind of setting yourself up for failure there. So let me highlight a couple key wins with partners. We just announced a key win with Centralis, which is also through our partnership with IBM. So this is one of the biggest hospitals in the UK, one of the National Health Service trusts. Poor desktop performance up to a 15-minute boot time and login time, as part of a PC refresh, as well as redoing their whole application desktop virtualization space. They chose to go with a VMware View with IBM, with Atlantis ILIO Diskless VDI for that implementation. This is a stateless implementation. This is a win with one of our national partners, MTM. This was an $11 billion apparel retailer with some of the biggest brands that you would recognize. They were having storage. They ran into storage bottlenecks, exactly what we talked about, And they're an interesting one because they're an example of, they have a mix of 9,000 XenApp users and then 1,000 stateless VDI users for which they've used diskless VDI. So they're doing completely in-memory deployment. They run the Citrix PBS write cache on Atlantis ILIO. And then WWT, another one of our national partners, U.S. Army Medical Command. So 8 of the large U.S. Army hospitals implemented with Atlantis ILIO. We reduced login times from 5 minutes to 30 seconds. We reduced the number of SAN disks required from 1,000 to 240. So in this case, we used the disk-back architecture where we optimized the existing storage. And they used it for healthcare, applications that doctors log into in the hospitals and nurses and staff. Kelway is an interesting one. They're actually one of the largest Citrix resellers in the UK. They actually implemented internally and then subsequently sold a lot and have a very large pipeline for using Atlantis with XenApp. So I encourage you, if you're a partner, to deploy Atlantis internally and kind of experience the benefits. It makes it much easier for your sales teams to sell the product and understand the value. So they were actually acquiring another reseller. They had an increasing help desk volume. They were overloading their storage, so their storage was a mixed workload environment. And when they went to Atlantis ILIO for XenApp in memory, their storage utilization dropped by 70–80%. And their help desk calls from performance issues with XenApp dropped dramatically as well. There's actually a whole webinar on this with Jonathan, the practice lead at Kelway. It's a great webinar if you haven't seen it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about why Atlantis is unique. So first of all, we can deliver extremely low cost per desktop while delivering a virtual desktop experience that's faster than a PC. We can do stateless VDI with no storage at all, which means that you can reach numbers like under $200 per desktop with 300 IOPS per user. We can do persistent VDI in memory as well, and we use a very small amount of storage on the back end with memory as the primary data store. And I mean, part of the most critical thing is that we can reduce project risks. We bring a lot of expertise to the table, and we can help migrate from persistent to stateless to XenApp with no change in the underlying infrastructure, and it's pure software. So it works, and we have partnerships with a lot of the key hardware vendors that you sell, so we fit nicely into pretty much any architecture without changing things. Okay, so let me take a minute and we can do a little bit of demo here. So let's see if my desktop here. So this this is at my actual desktop. Here I have a performance monitor chart, which is just a part of Windows. We have this graph is IOPS, so it was 0 IOPS to 3,000 IOPS. So I'll do a couple things for you, and we'll check back in on the IOPS here. So I have a little script here that starts all of my Office applications. So you'll see I can run all of the Office applications, launch almost instantly, and are available to use almost immediately. So here we can do Outlook, we can do all of the applications. So they're all ready to use. So we have them all here. And you can see that if you go back, that caused about 1,500 IOPS there. And that's similar to that chart I showed you on the slide. So, instant application launch is one of my favorite things about user experience. So it's one of the things you notice the most once you start using a virtual desktop with Atlantis or in memory, or even a laptop with a local SSD. Launching applications fast and launching multiple applications at the same time is huge for user experience. here we can, another thing that I love on my virtual desktop is search. So if I go to my Windows Explorer here, let me log in so it stops bothering me to do that. Okay, so if I do, so what I'll do this again, I'll do a search, but if you look at the office here, so if I go, so I've done a star for my entire C drive, so thousands of files that popped up instantly, all able to access after search. I can do, let's do a star.pdf or something. So they're all there instantly. Normally, this would have a progress bar that would last many minutes if you had a lot of PDF applications, but it'll be instant. Okay, so let's go. Okay, so let me go back to Performance Monitor. So you can see that I'm doing all this stuff. It's generating a lot of IOPS. And if you were limited to like 10 IOPS, which would be very down here at the bottom, like a traditional VDI environment, you would have, it would just take longer to do each of these functions. So you would be capped at that number of IOPS. Now, if you ever want to go try out, on a virtual desktop and you want to constrain yourself, you can actually go into Virtual Center and constrain your IOPS to 50 or 100 and see what it. If you do the same launch applications with 50 IOPS, it takes several minutes to launch all the applications. So you can see I'm doing nothing and it's spiking here, to almost 1,000. So you can hear I've gone to 1,600 at peak. Now let me show you what it's capable of. So here I'm going to run a test, and I'm going to do a disk benchmark. So it's going to do a series of sequential and random reads. So this takes a minute, but you'll see that the IO starts going up here. And this is actually on our production environment with everybody else running on the same server. So other people are generating IO at the same time. So here you're seeing it's hitting 15,000 IOPS in one desktop, which is a tremendous amount of IOPS. I've seen it go up to as much as 40,000 when there are fewer people running on the same server. So that's it. Let me go back and we'll take some questions. Or actually, let me wrap up first, and then we'll get into the Q&A. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about why you should partner with Atlantis. First thing is we can increase and protect margin. You're actually going to make quite a bit of money on the Atlantis itself, but you'll also be able to upsell into your existing install base. We're going to make you more competitive from a cost per desktop perspective, so you'll be able to go in with a lower bid than competitors that don't use Atlantis, and then you're also going to make more points on that lower bid. We often see that people, once you can get that cost per desktop down, the total size of the project increases. So someone might have a $10 million budget for the project. If we can get them 5,000 users, for that $10 million budget, then you're going to increase the size of the overall deal. What we also see is that as you increase the sizes of the deals faster, as you deploy faster, that there's a significant drag. So for every dollar of Atlantis that's sold, there's $4 to $8 in profit on other items, other pieces of software, other pieces of hardware. So the fact that we can take that pilot deployment of 1,000 users and scale that much higher and faster, so you might get your next follow-on sale from a deal faster because you're able to deploy that first 1,000. You're very successful. You come in at a cost per desktop below a physical PC. Now they're going to adopt the VDI or XenApp across the entire organization, and you'll have a follow-on sale that's much bigger and much faster. So that's what we've kind of seen with partners. So let me, with that, transition into Q&A. So if you have any questions, please submit them via the chat window, and Carrie will ask me some of the questions.
Thanks, Seth. Our first question is Atlantis integrated with VAI?
So we're actually in the process of integrating with VAI. That should be available in Q1 of 2014.
Another question was, do you have any studies on employee performance or frustration when a VDI solution performs poorly?
Yeah, we don't have any surveys or studies, but we've seen in customer after customer, we're often, there's kind of two scenarios where Atlantis is brought in. One is kind of upfront to make the business case better, or we're part of a standard architecture from a partner. The other one is we're kind of brought in after there's been a problem to solve the performance problems. And in those scenarios, we see, often see that it's been driven by users being dissatisfied with their physical desktop. You can look at, several of the webcasts we've done, like Washington Trust Bank, for example. They got up to 90 users and overloaded their storage. And the symptom is always users calling the help desk complaining about, my application didn't launch, or, things are moving slow, I can't log in. That's kind of the symptoms, and that happens over and over again with customers. You can kind of look at some of our case studies where we've come in to solve a failed deployment, and that's almost always the symptom. Kellaway was also another good example of that. They had increasing, as their storage ran into IO contention, the user experience degraded, which led to freezing applications, longer login times, and so forth. And you saw a spike in their help desk call volume related to performance problems. And then you install Atlantis, and that dropped by 70% the next month and stayed low. So those are some of the examples of, as you improve user experience. And it's almost always the symptom that causes, a re-architecture or redesign of the environment.
Does Atlantis integrate with Dell vWorkspace?
So Dell vWorkspace will work fine. We have not done a specific reference architecture on Dell vWorkspace, but Atlantis is really something that operates as a VM that exposes a standard NFS or iSCSI data store at the hypervisor level. So it's really more oriented to what hypervisor you're using, and we support vSphere, Hyper-V. We just announced support for Hyper-V v3 Server 2012, and then Server. So it will work with any VDI broker, including Citrix, VMware, Quest vWorkspace, or even just using RDS or some other form to access the desktop. It's more of a optimization that's done at the hypervisor level as opposed to tying into the specific VDI broker.
Okay. Any cloud services using Atlantis to deliver a cloud desktop service?
Yes, actually there's a case study available and video available on the website. Colt is one of the larger service providers in Europe, and they offer a cloud-hosted, uses VMware View, and there's actually a 10,000 user reference implementation on our website that you can look at for that. And they actually use the in-memory implementation. It's based on a vBlock-based architecture with Cisco UCS servers. So you're welcome to download that from our, if you go to company and resources and reference architectures on our website, you'll be able to find that 10,000 user reference implementation for that cloud hosted. That's also the implementation that won Best of VMworld Europe 2012.
Okay, and we have one last question. It may be a little too technical, so let me know. But another VAI question. How technically does it offload the clone process? Is the clone process completely offloaded in memory?
So we have a feature called Atlantis ILIO Fast Clone, and what that does is it creates full clones without having to copy any data. So it basically, because we are, inherently deduplicating and compressing all of the underlying blocks, we can create new fast clones in, 5 seconds or less. So you can deploy, we have reference architectures where we've deployed, 1,000 users, and it can all be done in parallel in memory. So the fast clones happen on individual Atlantis ILIOs, which there's one per host. So we have had implementations where people can redeploy thousands and thousands of users in a very short period of time, in minutes, because it's tied to, it's maybe 5 seconds or so per clone, but it's all parallelized across as many servers as you want to implement. So when we do VAI, we'll be using that fast clone feature, which already exists. It'll just be simplifying the process of doing that with Vue. If you want to look at fast clones, there's a reference architecture with Cisco with VMware Vue, where we did fast cloning times. I believe it was a minute or two to do 120 or 140 clones per server. And that could be for an infinite number of servers.
We had another question. Is ILIO clustered?
So ILIO, there are different architectures for Atlantis ILIO depending on the map to the different desktop virtualization models. In all cases, we run one ILIO virtual machine per server. In our disk-backed and in-memory architecture, like this was VDI architectures, they are not clustered. They operate independently, but are managed from Atlantis ILIO Center for any updates. But there's no one host going down does not affect any of the other ILIOs, for example, like they would in a cluster. Now, there is one architecture that's our persistent VDI in-memory architecture, where we have what's called a replication host that creates a cluster. And the function of that is to allow you to run virtual desktops in memory as its primary storage, but then replicate all unique I/O through the replication host to back-end storage for backup and recovery. And in that case, there's a cluster in the sense of the replication host is tied to a certain number of Atlantis ILIO VMs, typically 5 to 10, which represent 5 to 10 server hosts and maybe 500 to 1,000 users. Any other questions, Carrie?
So going off of that question, if it is not clustered, then how do you fail over in a case of an HA event?
So again, that's somewhat dependent on the architecture you choose. Typically, so in a stateless VDI implementation, HA is kind of handled at a higher level, at the broker level. So if there's a server that's running desktops that powers off, for example, the user will be logged out, they log back in, they get put on another server. So you don't really need to use HA for the purpose of moving that VM to another host. Now, in persistent VDI, you actually, tend to have user information, and users have a one-to-one mapping with their virtual machine. So if that host with a user's virtual machine goes down, you actually need to do HA onto a standby host or onto another running host. So what we do is we leverage the hypervisor's HA. So in a VMware vSphere environment, you would use HA to restart all of those desktops onto a standby host. So we're leveraging the underlying hypervisor capabilities. We are just a VM, and you can use things like affinity rules to tie the VMs on that host to the ILIO and move them separately. So we have some different configurations for that, and we have HA configuration guides, documentation on how to do that. We also have a blog on HA. Any other questions?
How is ILIO licensed?
So ILIO is licensed on a per user basis, and in most cases, there is one exception where you have the option to do per user or per physical host. So that is in the XenApp implementation. So in general, it's per user. There are different SKUs for persistent VDI, diskless VDI, stateless VDI, and XenApp. So you basically buy the number of licenses that correlate to what you bought from Citrix, VMware, or someone mentioned Quest Workspace on a named user basis.
Thanks, Seth. That was our last question for today.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for attending the webinar, and I'll turn it back to Terry.
Okay, thank you guys for attending today. We really appreciate all of your questions. I will be sending out the webinar recording later on this afternoon, so look for that in your inbox. If you have any additional questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to us at marketing@atlantiscomputing.com. And thank you again for joining us. Have a good day.